The moment I found the cellar door hidden beneath 40 years of decomposed apple leaves, I understood why my stepmother had fought so viciously to keep me from ever setting foot on this property. But that discovery was still 3 days away. First, I had to survive being thrown out of the only home I'd known since I was 7 years old. Rewind to Monday morning, November 18th, when everything collapsed. I came home from my 6 a.m. shift at Providence Hospital in Yakima, Washington, where I worked as a patient transport aide for $17.20 an hour, to find my bedroom door removed from its hinges and everything I owned, 29 years of life, packed into a single rolling suitcase and 3 garbage bags on the front lawn. The house I'd grown up in, the house my father had paid off before dying of pancreatic cancer 18 months ago, stood closed against me like a fist. Catherine, my stepmother of 15 years, opened the door 6 inches, her face carefully blank. "You're 30 years old, Sarah," she said, her voice carrying that practiced, reasonable tone that made opposition sound childish. "Your father's gone. This is my house now. I've been more than generous letting you stay this long." "The mortgage was paid," I said, my voice shaking. "Dad left instructions. Your father left me the property in a living trust, properly executed and notarized. I've consulted with my attorney, Richard Berman at Cascade Legal Partners. You have no claim here. I'm entitled to exclusive use of my own home." She handed me a document through the gap, 3 pages clipped together. I scanned it with numb fingers. Legal language confirming the house had been transferred to Catherine Chen 6 months before my father's death, with his signature witnessed and sealed. My name appeared nowhere. "That's not possible," Dad promised. "People promise many things when they're dying and emotional. Reality is different." She glanced at the bags on the lawn. "I've packed everything personal. The furniture stays, it's mine. You have until 5 p.m. to remove those items, or they'll be donated." The door closed. I stood on the lawn of 4782 Maple Ridge Drive, in the neighborhood where I'd learned to ride a bike and had my first kiss, and stayed up late helping my father with his accounting work, and felt the ground dissolve beneath me. I'd been saving for 18 months, pulling every double shift I could get at the hospital, building toward a down payment on a modest condo. My savings account held $11,340, substantial for someone at my income level, but insufficient for any immediate housing solution in Yakima, where studio apartments started at $1,100 monthly and require first, last, and security deposit up front. I'd already applied to 3 apartments that week. All had wait lists of 30 or more applicants. The cheapest room for rent I'd found was $850 monthly, available December 1st, requiring $1,700 to move in. I loaded my bags into my 2012 Ford Focus and sat in the driver's seat, breathing carefully, doing the math. 13 days until the room was available. I could afford a motel for perhaps 3 nights at $89 per night plus taxes, $280 that would gut my moving-in fund. I could sleep in my car, but November in central Washington meant temperatures in the 20s at night, and the Focus had no space to lie flat. Then I remembered the orchard. My mother, my biological mother, Diana Foster, had died when I was 7, a brain aneurysm that took her in 45 seconds while she was folding laundry. Before she'd married my father, she'd inherited 23 acres of old apple orchard from her parents, property about 35 miles southeast of Yakima, near the town of Outlook, Washington. I'd gone there exactly twice as a child, once for my grandmother's funeral and once the summer after, before the property was abandoned to property taxes and neglect. I'd assumed the land had been sold or foreclosed decades ago. At the Yakima County Assessor's Office, a helpful clerk named Ramon searched the database while I stood at the counter, my hands gripping the edge to stay steady. "Foster Orchard, 1847 Outlook Mapton Road," he said, reading from his screen. 23.6 acres, assessed value $47,000. Last structure survey 1998. Property taxes, current through this year. Paid automatically through a trust account at Columbia Basin Bank. My breath caught. Current. Says here there's a standing account. Established 1994. Auto payment for property taxes. Balance sufficient for approximately 15 more years. He turned the monitor so I could see. Looks like your mother set it up before she passed. Smart planning. Is there a building on it? He clicked through screens. Original farmhouse was condemned and demolished in 2003. There's a notation of a secondary structure. Looks like an equipment shed or storage building, approximately 650 square feet. No utilities connected. No septic system listed for that structure. I took a photo of the screen with my trembling phone. Can I go there? Is it legal to enter? If you're the heir, you'd need to file paperwork to transfer the title officially, but nobody's going to stop you from accessing property that's in your family name and current on taxes. He wrote down an address for the county land records office. You'll want to get the title sorted eventually, but for now, it's not like anyone else is using it. I drove southeast on State Route 241 as the afternoon sun dropped toward the Horse Heaven Hills, the landscape transforming from residential Yakima to agricultural flatland, apple orchards and vineyards stretching in geometric patterns, irrigation pivots standing like industrial sculptures. Outlook was barely a town, a cluster of buildings at a crossroads, population maybe 300. I turned onto Outlook Mapton Road, a rural highway bordered by orchards, and watched the numbers on mailboxes climb. At mile marker 7, I found it. A rusted mailbox leaning at 45 degrees, the name Foster barely visible beneath years of weather damage. A dirt road, barely distinguishable from the drainage ditch beside it, led into a property choked with dead grass and volunteer apple trees growing wild. The road curved for a quarter mile, and then I saw it. The orchard my mother had described in stories. 200 apple trees, maybe more, planted in rows that were now broken and overgrown. Many trees dead, others producing small, bitter fruit that rotted on the ground. And at the back of the property, against a line of 30-foot Lombardy poplars, stood a small wooden structure with a corrugated metal roof. The shed was weathered gray, its paint long gone, but the roof was intact and the walls were straight. A single door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. One window, glass somehow unbroken, faced the orchard. I parked and approached with my flashlight. The door opened with pressure, revealing a single room. Concrete floor, exposed beam ceiling, empty except for mouse droppings and decades of dust. But it was solid, dry. The roof didn't leak. There was space for my suitcase, my bags, maybe an air mattress if I bought one. It was shelter. I sat on the concrete floor as the sun set and cried for the first time since my father's funeral, not from despair, but from exhausted relief. This wasn't the life I'd planned. It wasn't even close. But it was mine, and Catherine couldn't take it away. Later, as I swept the floor with a branch broken from a dead tree, my makeshift broom caught on an irregularity in the corner, a metal ring, flush with the concrete, covered by 40 years of decomposed leaves that had blown through the open door and compressed into a dense mat. I pulled the mat away and found a wooden trapdoor, 3 feet square, with a modern padlock that looked absurdly new compared to everything around it. The hardware store in Outlook, a place called Benson's Farm Supply that looked unchanged since 1970, sold bolt cutters for $34.99. I bought them with cash, along with a camping lantern, batteries, bottled water, and a sleeping bag rated to 15 degrees. The total was $127.83. My savings account balance, $11,212.17. The woman at the register, maybe 60, with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes, looked at my purchases with an expression I couldn't read. "You camping this time of year?" she asked. "Something like that. I inherited property nearby. Checking it out." "Foster Place." At my surprised look, she nodded. "Small town. Remote at the assessor's office is my nephew. He mentioned someone asking about the old orchard." She bagged my items slowly, deliberately. "Your mother, Diana. I went to school with her. She was a good person. Smart. That orchard was her family's pride before the market collapsed, and they couldn't afford to maintain it." "Did you know about the shed?" "I knew her father built it in the 70s, used it for equipment storage, and sometimes as a workshop. Diana used to hide out there when she was a teenager, reading books." The woman, her name tag said Marge, handed me the bag. "If you need anything while you're sorting that property out, we're here until 6 p.m. most days." I drove back to the orchard with the bolt cutters on my passenger seat and a strange, tight feeling in my chest. The November afternoon was cold, temperature maybe 38 degrees, and the sky was the color of steel wool. I parked and carried my supplies into the shed, arranging them against one wall. The sleeping bag, the lantern, the water, The small propane camp stove I'd bought on impulse for $23. Then I knelt by the trapdoor with the bolt cutters. The padlock was high quality, probably worth more than the shed itself. It took 4 minutes of sustained pressure before the shackle snapped with a sound like a gunshot. I pulled the trap door open, raising dust that made me cough, and shined my flashlight down into darkness. A wooden ladder descended 8 feet into a concrete-lined cellar, maybe 10 feet by 12, with walls that looked professionally poured. The air rising from below was cool and dry, not the damp rot I'd expected. At the bottom, metal shelving units lined 2 walls, and sitting on those shelves were 12 large plastic storage containers, the kind with airtight seals, each labeled with years: 1991, 1992, 1993. I climbed down with my hands shaking. The first container I opened, labeled 1991 to 1994, contained files, dozens of manila folders organized with tabs, filled with documents in my mother's neat handwriting. Bank statements, investment records, copies of stock certificates for companies I recognized. Microsoft, purchased in 1986 for $21 per share, 200 shares. Apple, purchased in 1985 for $14 per share, 300 shares. Amazon, purchased in 1997 at its IPO, 500 shares. I sat down hard on the concrete floor, the flashlight beam shaking in my grip. My mother had been an accountant. I remembered that. She'd worked for a small firm in Yakima, handling business taxes and financial planning. My grandmother had left her $40,000 when she died in 1983, and my mother, according to these records, had invested it methodically, researching emerging technology companies with the careful precision of someone who understood numbers. The next container held more recent records, continuing through 2006, 5 years after my mother's death. Someone had maintained the accounts, documented every dividend, every stock split, every transaction. A sticky note on the inside lid was in handwriting I didn't recognize. Sarah, if you're reading this, your father and I agreed you shouldn't know about this until you were ready. The money was always meant for you. Catherine. I stared at the note, my mind refusing to process. The woman who'd just thrown me out had been maintaining my mother's investment accounts for 20 years. The third container held a letter, sealed in plastic, dated August 12th, 1 month before my father died. I opened it with numb fingers. Sarah, I know by the time you read this, I'll be gone and things between you and Catherine will likely be difficult. I'm sorry. I've made mistakes in how I handled your mother's legacy. When Diana died, she had $240,000 in stock investments, all held in trust for you, accessible when you turned 25 or when you needed it for education, housing, or emergency. I remarried quickly, too quickly, and Catherine agreed to manage the trust since she had financial experience. The plan was to tell you when you finished college, but you stayed home to help me when I got sick, and I kept putting it off. The house situation is complicated. I signed it over to Catherine to protect it from medical bankruptcy. I owed $370,000 in treatment costs before I qualified for expanded Medicaid. It was the only way to keep you from inheriting my debt. The trust is separate, protected. Catherine knows. She has instructions. I'm sorry I handled this badly. You deserve better. I love you, Dad. I read it 3 times, tears dripping onto the plastic sleeve. There were more containers. Investment statements through 2024, showing the accounts had been rolled into diversified index funds, growth tracked carefully. A spreadsheet printed 2 weeks ago, showing current value, $1,847,000. $1.8 million. From Microsoft and Apple and Amazon bought when they were nothing, held for 33 years. I climbed back up the ladder and sat on the shed's concrete floor, staring at my phone. It was 4:17 p.m. The sun was setting, turning the dead orchard gold and amber. I had $1.8 million in a trust account I'd known nothing about, and I was sitting in a shed with 1 suitcase and 3 garbage bags, having been kicked out of my home by the woman who'd been protecting my inheritance for 2 decades. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. I called the number on the investment statements, a firm called Pacific Crest Financial Management in Seattle. A woman answered, professional and cool. I'm calling about an account under Diana Foster's trust, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I'm the beneficiary, Sarah Foster Chen. 1 moment, please. A pause, keyboard clicking. Miss Chen? Yes, we have you in our system. You're listed as primary beneficiary, accessible at age 25 or under specified conditions. You turned 29 in March, correct? Correct. Then the account is fully accessible to you. Did you need to make a transaction? I need to understand why I didn't know about it. Her voice softened slightly. That's beyond our scope, ma'am. We manage assets according to trust instructions. The trustee, Chen, has been filing regular reports, all of which show appropriate management. If you want to assume control or request a full accounting, we can facilitate that. I want to assume control. We'll need identity verification and a meeting at our Seattle office, or we can arrange a video conference with notarized documents. Given the account size, we require enhanced security protocols. I scheduled a video call for Wednesday, 2 days away. Then I sat in the gathering darkness of the shed, surrounded by 40 years of dust and apple-scented decay, and tried to understand what my father had done. He protected me from his medical debt by giving Catherine the house. Catherine had protected my mother's investments by maintaining them in silence. And I'd spent 18 months working double shifts for $17.20 an hour, saving $11,000, believing I had nothing. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Sarah, this is Catherine. Before you decide I'm a monster, call me. Please. I didn't call. Instead, I spent that first night in the sleeping bag on the shed floor, the propane heater glowing blue in the darkness, thinking about inheritance and intention and the ways people protect each other badly. By morning, I'd made decisions. I drove to Yakima and met Catherine at a Starbucks on 1st Street, neutral territory, 8 a.m. on a Wednesday. She looked smaller than I remembered, older, her careful makeup not quite hiding the exhaustion around her eyes. I didn't know how to tell you, she said before I could speak. Your father was dying, drowning in medical bills, terrified he'd leave you with nothing but debt collectors. The house was his only real asset. He signed it over to me 14 months before he passed, after the bankruptcy attorney said it was the only legal way to protect it. I agreed because I thought. She stopped, her hands tied around her coffee cup. I thought we'd have time, that he'd recover enough to explain everything, that I could be the adult, the manager, and eventually transition you into the full picture. So you threw me out instead? Her face crumpled slightly. You were living there for free, working yourself into exhaustion, refusing to move forward. I thought, and I know this sounds terrible, I thought if you had to struggle, just for a little while, you'd finally access the trust. Use the resources you actually had instead of martyring yourself at minimum wage. $17 an hour isn't minimum wage. Sarah, you have nearly $2 million and you're working night shifts transporting patients. That's not nobility, it's fear. I stared at her. You could have just told me. Your father tried, twice. The conversations went nowhere. You shut down whenever we mentioned your mother, or money, or plans for after he died. You wouldn't see a grief counselor. You wouldn't even take a week off work. Catherine's voice was steady but raw. I'm not your mother. I never tried to be. But I've spent 20 years managing those accounts, filing reports, making sure your inheritance grew, and watching you pretend you had nothing. I couldn't do it anymore. So you traumatized me instead. Yes. She met my eyes. I did. And maybe that makes me the villain of your story. But you're here now, and you know the truth, and maybe that's worth something. I left without answering, drove to the county land office, and filed paperwork to officially transfer the orchard property into my name. A process that would take 30 days but cost only $175 in filing fees. Then I went to Pacific Crest Financial Management via video conference, provided notarized identification, and assumed full control of the trust account. The money was real. $1,847,340.82, held in diversified index funds and municipal bonds, generating approximately $73,000 annually in dividends and interest. I could buy a house outright, could go back to school, could travel, could stop working night shifts and build the life I'd deferred since my father's diagnosis. Instead, I bought supplies. Over the next 3 weeks, I transformed the shed into something livable. I hired a local contractor named Gil Martinez, who specialized in rural properties, to install a small solar panel array on the roof, for $1,200 for panels, batteries, and a basic electrical system. He added insulation, repaired the window, installed a small propane heater with a proper vent, another $2,800. I bought a camping toilet, a water filtration system connected to a hand dug, while Gil helped me locate a hot plate, a mini fridge that ran off the solar battery. Total cost $8,340, paid in cash from the trust account that Gil's wife helped me set up at Columbia Basin Bank, a checking account with $50,000 transferred for immediate living expenses. The shed became a tiny house, 650 square feet of intentional simplicity. I could stand up, cook, sleep warm. I had electricity for my laptop and phone. The orchard stretched outside my window, dead and beautiful. I kept my job at the hospital, but dropped to 30 hours a week. With my living expenses now minimal, no rent, no utilities beyond propane, maybe $400 monthly for food and supplies. I didn't need the money, but I needed the structure, the purpose, the contact with people whose problems were immediate and physical. In January, I hired an orchard management company from Yakima, a firm called Heritage Fruit Consulting, to assess the property. Their report was thorough. Of the 213 apple trees, 87 were salvageable with aggressive pruning. The rest needed removal. The soil was good, the irrigation system reparable. Estimated cost to restore the orchard to modest production, $34,000 over 2 years. I authorized the work. By March, I'd enrolled in online classes through Washington State University's horticultural program, studying orchard management and sustainable agriculture. I wasn't planning to become a commercial farmer. The orchard would never be profitable at this scale. But I wanted to understand what my mother's family had built, what my mother had preserved, what I now carried forward. Catherine and I met once more, in April, back at the same Starbucks. She brought documents, 20 years of trust reports, every decision documented, every dollar accounted for. She'd taken no trustee fees, had paid for financial management from her own funds. "I'm sorry I hurt you," she said quietly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to know I was trying, badly, to do what your father asked. He asked you to throw me out? He asked me to make sure you didn't waste your life in grief. He was terrified you'd become small, scared, stuck." She pushed the documents across the table. "These are yours. Everything's documented. The house is mine legally, but if you ever want to challenge that, I won't fight it." I didn't know what else to do. I took the documents. "I don't want the house." She looked startled. "Sarah, I have what I need." And I meant it. The orchard bloomed in late April, the surviving trees producing clouds of white and pink blossoms that attracted bees from neighboring farms. I walked through the rows in the early morning, pruning shears in hand, learning to shape growth and encourage health. The work was physical, meditative, completely different from my hospital shifts where everything was urgency and crisis. In May, Marge from Benson's Farm Supply stopped by with a pie, rhubarb, homemade, and an offer to connect me with the local Growers Association. "You're Diana's daughter," she said, standing in the orchard while I showed her the restoration work. "She'd be proud of this, of you figuring it out." "I didn't figure anything out," I said. "I just got kicked out and ended up here. That's usually how it works. Nobody finds their life on purpose." She looked around at the pruned trees, the cleared rows, the shed with its solar panels catching sunlight. "This is good land. Your mother knew that. She kept it for a reason." By June, I've reduced my hospital hours to 20 per week and started volunteering with a youth financial literacy program in Yakima, teaching teenagers about investing and compound interest. I told them about my mother, who'd bought Microsoft for $21 per share because she understood the future. I told them about being 30 years old, sleeping in a shed, discovering I was a millionaire. I told them that money was security but not identity, that inheritance was both gift and burden, that sometimes you had to lose everything to understand what you actually needed. The orchard produced its first small harvest in September. 800 pounds of apples from the healthiest trees, mostly Honeycrisp and Gala. I donated most of it to the Yakima Food Bank, kept enough to make cider and sauce, and spent an afternoon at a farmer's market selling the rest for $2 per pound, more for the experience than the profit. I still live in the shed. I've made it comfortable, a real bed, bookshelves, a small desk where I study horticulture and manage the trust investments I've learned to understand. The cellar below holds my mother's records and my own growing collection of agricultural journals and seed catalogs. The orchard stretches outside my window, healing slowly, producing more each year. I'm 31 now. I have $1.9 million in investments I didn't earn, land I inherited by accident, and a life I never planned. Catherine and I exchange emails occasionally, cordial and distant. I don't know if I've forgiven her. I don't know if forgiveness is the right framework. What I know is this: being kicked out with one suitcase broke me open to a truth I'd been avoiding. That I'd been living small not from necessity, but from fear, from loyalty to grief, from the belief that moving forward meant leaving my parents behind. The orchard taught me differently. Growth requires pruning. Fruit requires seasons of dormancy. Inheritance isn't just what you receive, but what you choose to cultivate. Last week, a young woman showed up at the orchard in a car packed with garbage bags, asking if I knew of anywhere cheap to stay. She'd been evicted, had nowhere to go, was working 2 jobs, and still couldn't find housing. I saw myself in her exhausted face. I gave her the number for Heritage Fruit Consulting, who'd mentioned needing seasonal workers. I gave her Marge's number at the farm supply store. I gave her $500 in cash from my wallet and told her it wasn't charity, it was investment, that someone once protected an inheritance for me badly, and I was still figuring out how to do better. She cried in my doorway, and I understood that inheritance travels in strange directions. That sometimes you're saved by people who hurt you. That the cellar beneath a forgotten shed can hold more than money. It can hold the careful planning of people who loved you, who tried their broken best, who left you maps to a future they'd never see. The orchard blooms every spring now, reliable as heartbreak, beautiful as second chances. I stand among the trees my mother's family planted, tending fruit I'll mostly give away, and feel something close to peace. Not happiness exactly, but its foundation. The certainty that I was broken down to nothing and discovered I was wealthier than I'd ever imagined. Not because of money, but because I'd learned what money was actually for. Building the life that comes after survival. Planting trees you'll never see fully grown. Protecting the people who come after you, even if they never know your name. My mother understood that. My father tried to. Catherine got it wrong in the execution, but right in the outcome. And I'm learning, slowly, in an orchard that's healing, with hands that are finally doing the work that matters. The shed still stands, small and weathered, impossible to see from the road. But it's home, and underneath it, in a cellar lined with concrete and secrets, my inheritance waits. Not for me anymore, but for whoever comes next, whoever needs proof that being forgotten can sometimes be its own kind of salvation.